It's The Law Show on CL 650. A comprehensive look at everything you need to know about the law.
On this side of the law, on that side of the law. Who is weak, who is wrong, who is for and who's against the law.
Hey, and welcome to the show. A great intro for our segment today. We're talking about wills and estates. And joining me from Macquarie Hunter is Alyssa Lockhart, partner at Macquarie Hunter, and also Leah Donaldson, associate at Macquarie Hunter. Now, you're the partner. I'm going to start with Leah for a moment because Leah's been on before.
Excellent.
This is her third time here on the radio.
It is.
So you work in the family law department and estate litigation?
I do. So I provide family law services, but I also work in estate litigation with J.C. Wingson.
Okay, so there we go. So get that out of the way. And now, you are a partner there, and this is all you do is wills and estates?
I do wills, trusts, and estates, which is generally referred to as succession planning. So I have a corporate practice, and I work to move assets from one generation to another in hopefully a seamless manner.
Now, how much money is set to transfer from one generation to the next? So we have the baby boomers are getting older now, and they have acquired a lot of money through assets like real estate. So how much money are we talking here?
Trillions.
Really?
Trillions. Absolutely.
And when there's trillions at play, that's when the fights begin, right?
That's when the fights begin. That's when the documents need to be tight and clear and sometimes plentiful. Hopefully not. Hopefully we can do something fairly simple for clients to structure them so that everybody understands what's going to happen and everybody agrees with what is about to happen after the passing. But if that doesn't work out, we have Leah.
And that's when you go to court.
Yes.
Okay, so how is it? I'm interested that this is sort of separate. You're the planning side, and then Leah is the side that goes to court. So
right.
why is it done that way?
Well, it wasn't always done that way. Certainly, I used to be a litigator. I used to go to court. But my skill set is really talking with clients and drawing information out of them. And I enjoy that. I enjoy the structuring of a deal. I enjoy looking at how an asset of a company, an asset of a family, might be moved from one hand to another without increasing tax obligations, minimizing strife between siblings. Sometimes one sibling is involved in running a family farm, or one sibling stays home and takes care of mom and dad in their waning years, and the others go out and get to have their own lives, so to speak. So I look at how we can plan, and that's interesting to me, and I feel that I can be helpful to clients, and I like working with clients while they're going through that process. From the flip side, what Leah sees is when a person didn't understand the plan or didn't accept the plan, then questions have to be answered. And so it's just a different inquisitive part of the process.
And you see that's when things go sideways in the estate. That's when people come forward and say, well, I want my fair share, or I'm not being represented. So is that what you do? Yes,
absolutely. So usually it's when there's a conflict among family members, or there's some lack of clarity in some of the documents that Alyssa was talking about. And it's actually beneficial to have both departments. There's definitely crossover. We discuss files all the time. They're a great resource that we can draw on to learn more about the planning side of it. But definitely there is a sort of set of court rules and processes by which we can negotiate or litigate, if necessary, that it's its own sort of special area of the law.
Now, we have recently, I think it's 2014, have a new sort of set of guidelines for estate law. So can you explain what that is and what it looked like before and how it looks now?
Right. So in March of 2014, we finally, after many years of drafting, passed what we call WESA, the Wills, Estates, Succession Act. It's a specific to BC statute, so it's not federal, it's provincial. And prior to WESA, we had several different statutes that all covered the ground that WESA now covers as one omnibus type of umbrella statute. So pre-WESA, many of our statutes were significantly long in the tooth. They were dating back to times when assets were of a different value, our social understandings were different. For instance, in the event that a person passed without a will, there was a provision that the spouse would receive the first $65,000 of a deceased person's estate, and the remainder would be split between the spouse and the children. That $65,000 was intended to make sure that the wife could stay in the marital home if the husband passed first without a will.
And when was that written?
That was written a long time before the last few years of real estate in the GVRD, that's for sure. So that was one of the reasons that WESA was brought in, was to modernize. We also wanted to normalize with other provincial legislation and make sure that people could expect what they saw in other provinces to happen after death here in BC. If we liked those things, there are certain things we did differently, but it changed the game, and there's a lot of things that we might have been raised with, believing this is what happens when I pass away, that are now different under WESA.
Now, as a layperson, the way I understand it is that you couldn't leave people out. Is that true? Is that just a misunderstanding?
It is a misunderstanding, I think. And I hear clients come in all the time and they say, my last will, I was told to leave $100 or $1,000 to each of my children or to everyone. That's not accurate. $100 or $1,000 is the difference between the two is irrelevant. What we're doing there is we're identifying within the document the fact that we haven't merely forgotten to name a child. I'm sure Leah would see cases where the child who's been left out would argue, oh, it was simply a clerical oversight. Dad forgot to name all of us. Correct?
Yes. Yeah. So there is the variation provision. It used to be a separate act, the Wills Variation Act. It is now part of WESA. But yeah, the fact that you've left $100 or $1,000 doesn't negate an obligation to a child or a spouse, which is what that section of the WESA provides.
So let's ramp it up to a bigger number here. So
Yes.
you sell a house for $1 million and you've got two children and you leave it to one and the other gets nothing. Right. Is that allowed?
It is. It's not as easy as an equal division. Certainly there are a number of documents that I might talk with clients and put in place to paper the intent behind it, the rationale behind it. But what I always say to clients is, I have 3 children and they're a little on the young side for me to identify where they're going to go in their life. But let's say that one of them is gifted and becomes, a surgeon, a specialist, and is making a lot of money per year. The other one absolutely loves children. She goes into early childhood education and she self-actualizes every day. She loves her job, but she comes home and she knows that she'll never make that amount of money. And then let's say the third one is disabled or held back for any reason. And that's not the case for me, thankfully, yet, but it could happen at any time when we don't really know what's going to happen at the end of today, right? So when I look at that, is it equitable and fair for me to divide my estate 3 ways equally? Does that surgeon child need as much as my disabled child? Or even, would it change her life as much as it would change my early childhood educator child who's running a daycare out of her home perhaps, or working for a daycare and loves what she does, but simply doesn't have the ability to provide for her family and pay for education for her children with as much ease as my oldest? So equality and equity are not always linked. Okay.
Now, I mentioned $1 million because we're talking about millions of dollars now. Real estate has ramped up so much here in the last, say, 10, 20 years in the Lower Mainland. So are the fights bigger about what's left after someone passes? I
would say so. I think sometimes the fights over a small estate can be more bitter because there's been less to begin with, but Leah would be better to answer that.
Yeah, there are the odd file where even when there's not very much money to fight about, sometimes it does come down to possessions, which have a lot of sentimental value for people. But overall, I would say that the disputes or the litigation side of the area of law has increased because of the amount of money that's passing from the older generation to the baby boomers.
So getting it right the first time is the most important thing, and that's where your planning comes in. So I'm looking at this, it's not just about getting your will done, it's about planning your estate, right? And I want to talk a little bit later about paying the tax man, because that's they always get paid first, right?
They do.
So that's a big part of what you do, is planning how the money is going to move from one generation to the other without CRA grabbing it, right?
Well, without CRA grabbing it, but certainly there's a number of ways that can happen. So that's part of the succession planning, the wealth preservation side of my practice, where I'll work on those matters more with corporate clients. With respect to taxes on the individual personal side, we see people doing self-planning to avoid spending the time or sharing personal details or spending the money on a lawyer's will. And what they'll do is they'll put all of their assets into a joint holding with one child or maybe with all children, and tax consequences can flow from those decisions as well. So we want to be very careful in identifying what the tax consequences of transition on an RRSP, a principal residence, any of those types of situations where we don't have corporate assets but we have significant value in our personal hands. Some things can be done to minimize the taxman's grab, and other things that we do intuitively to avoid either what we think is the best way to avoid litigation or the best way to avoid the probate process, which I think is largely misunderstood. Those can actually trigger increased taxes.
So trying to avoid taxes, you end up triggering more tax. We're going to get into that a little bit later on. We're just getting started here. We have Alyssa Lockhart, a partner at Macquarie Hunter, and Leah Donaldson, associate at Macquarie Hunter, talking about wills and estates. And it's a fascinating subject. I know some people might think it's quite dry and a bit morbid, but it's something that you really need to do because of the values of property, especially from one generation to the next. We'll continue our conversation next on CL 650.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CL 650.